We are good, great. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I'm going to introduce Bridget Gallagher, who is the woman who has done a phenomenal job in putting together some of the best lectures for the fall. So if you are worried about what you are going to do this fall, go to our website, because we have a tremendous array of fantastic speakers, and I give credit to Bridget. She's done a great job. I'm intervening in tonight's introduction because I want to say a word about Jim Donahue. Jim is our curator for historic landscapes and gardens. He is also the person who does all of the planning and decorating for our Christmas activities at the Newport Mansions. So he's very talented on that end of things. And he's also one of the key people behind the Newport Flower Show every year. The look, the design, the feel of the show is really very much directed by Jim and his phenomenal group of garden club women and men who help us each year. And I know that 2021 will be the best flower show we've ever had. I wanted to share with you, though, the fact that earlier this week, I got a message. His name has become so renowned. Everybody wants to hear Jim, from none other than Martha Stewart, who wanted to know what time Jim was speaking, because she wanted to tune in because she has such high regard for him. And unfortunately, she was tied up at 5:30, but good news for Martha Stewart and for all of your friends. All of these lectures are taped. You can go to our website and find them. Just be a little patient. It will take us a day or two to get this particular lecture up online. But if one of your friends missed the lecture, or if you want to go back and listen again, please do so. And Martha, when you do tune in, we adore you. We want you to come back to the Newport Flower Show sometime. Thank you so much for giving such a great, great tribute to Jim. So Bridget, it's your turn.
Thank you so much for that, Trudy. And I want to thank you all for joining us virtually as we begin our 2020 Fall Lecture Series. We are so pleased that so many of you have tuned in tonight to hear our own Jim Donahue speak on women pioneers of American landscape architecture. But before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to provide some information on forthcoming lectures and current offerings, as well as how we will be running the show tonight. Please be sure to join us in a couple of weeks on Thursday, September 24th for the Preservation Society's Chief Conservator, Patty Miller's presentation on the Breakers geothermal system, a 19th and 21st century solution. Please send an email to programrsvp@newportmansions.org and be sure to title it Breakers Geothermal Lecture. And that goes to me personally. And next, Becoming Vanderbilt is now open at Rosecliff on Thursdays and Friday from 4 to 8 p.m. and Saturdays and Sundays from 1 to 6 p.m. You can go online to our website to purchase those tickets for this wonderful exhibition where you will discover the women of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Now on to the lecture tonight. Some important information for you to know how things are going to run. You will notice that you and your fellow participants are muted, and you will stay muted throughout the duration of this program. If you have not done so, please do, and you may stop your video as well. And then there will be a Q&A session at the way end, so please use that chat feature that Zoom provides, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Now on to our esteemed guest tonight, Jim Donahue. He is Preservation Society's Curator of Historic Landscape and Horticulture. Jim holds a BA from the College of the Holy Cross in Liberal Arts and Economics and a master's degree in Sustainable Landscape Design and Planning from the Conway School. Jim has been with the Preservation Society for 16 years, first as Chief Horticulturalist at Green Animals, and now as Curator of Landscapes. Many of you tuning in probably know him as the Horticulture Chair of the Newport Flower Show, or designer installer of Christmas at the Newport Mansions. So tonight he is wearing his curatorial hat. So please welcome Jim Donahue.
All right, just have to share my screen with you. Okay. Okay, I think we have everything up and running now. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you Bridget, and thank you Trudy. Tonight's topic, Women Pioneers of American Landscape Architecture, really came to my attention in planning for the Newport Flower Show, which, as you know, last June we regretfully had to postpone due to the pandemic. However, it will be back June 18th to 20th, 2021, with the same theme, which is Voices in the Garden. And as part of that theme, we were meant to convey how women and other groups of people have contributed to American landscape design. And since we had the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, plus our Becoming Vanderbilt exhibition at the Rosecliff Galleries, we thought it'd be a good idea to honor American landscape architects of the Gilded Age, women who really contributed to the profession of landscape architecture early on. So tonight we're going to be using glass lantern slides taken from the Garden Club of America collection at the Smithsonian Institution. Glass lantern slides are really interesting. They were used by the practitioners themselves, the ladies that we'll be seeing this evening, to give lectures at Garden Club of America branches on their own work. So the way they promoted themselves was to go to, say, the Garden Club of Fairfield and talk about Mrs. So-and-so's garden, and they would use these glass lanterns slides to illustrate their work. So the Garden Club of America gathered all of these slides together, and as a celebration of their 75th anniversary back when, and that would have been a while ago now, they donated them all to the Smithsonian Institution where they reside today. So you can actually search that database of glass lantern slides at the website at the bottom of the page. There are about 4,000 of them, I believe. Quite a bit to look at. I think they're a wonderful resource because they capture the gardens at a point in time when they were in their heyday. You know, gardens are ephemeral and are lost over time oftentimes. So they're a very useful resource to see the work of these women, especially at its best. So we're going to discuss 4 women tonight, all of whom started practicing in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. We're going to speak about Marian Cruger Coffin, Beatrix Farrand, Martha Hutchison, and Ellen Shipman. In no particular order, honestly. I'm just going to show you examples of their work and give you an overview of their practice, and maybe draw some similarities and differences between them. Each woman is illustrated by a quote because this theme of the show is Voices in the Garden for the flower show after all. So you can see here that Marian Cruger Coffin wrote, "We were pioneers, and moreover pioneer woman in a new old profession, and one in which all one's ability to see and interpret beauty out of doors taxed all of our resources. And we were determined to show what enthusiasm and hard work could accomplish." And she was very accomplished. Marian Cruger Coffin was born in New York City to a very wealthy patrician family, but due to circumstances needed to provide for herself and her mother, and so decided to become a landscape gardener, a profession considered suitable for a genteel young lady. Coffin studied landscape architecture at MIT, but after graduating in 1904 could not find employment as firms typically did not hire women. They were especially concerned that women would not be able to do the field work required in landscape construction supervision. After touring the gardens of England, Europe, and the Dalmatian coast with her mother and cousin Henry F. DuPont, Coffin opened her own firm in 1906, joining the American Society of Landscape Architects as a junior member that same year. Her early commissions came through family connections, which by the 1910s had propelled her into a successful and much sought after high society landscape designer. Coffin, as all the other women will be speaking tonight, specialized in large estate landscapes, and her talent for simple beauty wrought from neoclassical axial layouts and elegant plantings gained commissions from the likes of Marshall Field, Childs Frick, Edward Hutton, and many others of the Northeast elite. In 1918, Coffin was elected a Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, The same year, she was named the landscape architect for the campus of the University of Delaware, a position she held until 1952. By the way, to be named a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects is a huge honor. It means that you've accomplished something meaningful in your career. This campus planning project at the University of Delaware afforded Coffin the opportunity to design the grounds of a major American university from its inception. Her landscape design, based on straightforward geometry and simple planting schemes, created a dignified and elegant setting which complemented the red brick Georgian architecture on the campus. Coffin's most influential career booster was her cousin and her lifelong close friend, Henry Francis DuPont, who not only funded Coffin's landscape master plan for the University of Delaware, but hired her to create a master plan for Winterthur, his family's ancestral Delaware estate. Coffin's work at Winterthur, which spanned almost 50 years, established her as a masterful landscape architect capable of complex spatial designs of simple beauty. In 1940, Coffin authored Trees and Shrubs for Landscape Effects, which was well received critically, although not a bestseller on the New York Times or anything of that sort. In post-World War II, when estate commissions became fewer, she focused on institutional commissions, culminating in her 1947 redesign for the Rose Garden at the New York Botanical Garden, originally conceived by Beatrix Farrand in 1916. Marian Cruger Coffin designed landscapes until her 1957 death in New Haven, Connecticut at the age of 81. Since 1922, Coffin had spent every summer at Wendover, her Watch Hill, Rhode Island home, which was known for its collection of roses. And by the way, I found out recently that Marian Cruger Coffin is buried at Island Cemetery in Newport. I have not been able to discern why, but at some point I will be making a visit over there. So we're going to take a look at Marian Cruger Coffin's work on from glass lantern slides. And as I mentioned, she was the cousin of Henry Francis DuPont, and she worked at Winterthur on the master plan there from 1928 to 1955. Here we have an image of the spring garden at Winterthur. Now, Henry Francis DuPont was a very accomplished amateur horticulturist, as was pretty much everyone in his family. They had lived on a estate for generations, and they knew their trees, their shrubs, and especially in the case of Henry Francis DuPont, his spring bulbs. He was maniacal and obsessed with having thousands of spring bulbs in the very best of varieties. He was a very demanding client, and on some of Coffin's plans for the estate, there were as many as 75 reiterations demanded by the client. So it wasn't as if she got a free pass because she was a cousin. He actually did demand an awful lot of Marian and her office of draft people especially. Now in this reproduction of the glass lantern slide, I would consider this a typical estate era sort of garden, in that it is classical, European inspired, formal, symmetrical, sort of Italianate in its style, with its urns of pots on pedestals and statuary and alcoves. But what makes this really truly an American estate garden is the absolute crazy abundance of flowering plant material. I mean, there are flowering trees, flowering shrubs, there's phlox, there's tulips, there's everything you can possibly jam into such a small space. So this was not just about the neoclassical frame or the formal frame of the garden, it was about incredibly exuberant planting. It also conveyed a sense of wealth, that you could actually conceive, plant, and maintain a garden of this complexity. I think at the time this photo was taken, there were 40 gardeners on staff at Winterthur. Now, Coffin worked all over the Northeast. Here we have a picture from Thorndale, which is the estate of Thorne Oakley, and he was based in Millbrook, New York. I chose this because typically in Beaux-Arts, landscape architecture in which Coffin was trained, areas close to the house, terraces and such, were very formal and would feature things like balustrades in stone and alcoves with statuary and reflecting pools. We always think of them as being incredibly pristine. But in the early 20th century, in the late 19th as well, planting was much more exuberant. And I thought this was a good choice of slides because the planting actually looks sort of leggy, I think, to our contemporary eye. But nonetheless, the idea was to have a very formal framework and a very exuberant planting to complement it. Another picture from Thorndale, also in Millbrook, New York, is this axial, very long reflecting pool. And part of Coffin's practice was to extend the views from a room out from, say, a library through the landscape down an axial LA or long skinny garden or reflecting pool to the view beyond. And that's what she's doing here. You can see that her treatment of plant material was very restrained. She used large masses of a single type of plant. On the left, you see dozens of white birch underplanted, I think, with a ground cover of juniper. And then the hedge surrounding the entire deal is actually a very simple spirea or something of that sort. A very Italianate sort of note are the potted plants along the coping stones of the reflecting pool. I believe from the picture, those would be shrub roses. One interesting thing about these glass lantern slides is that they were, of course, printed in black and white, but they were hand colored. So oftentimes the colors aren't exactly true. Those could be hydrangeas, they could be roses. From the scale and from the color, you can't always be sure what we're getting in terms of the garden that was important in terms of its axial layout. And then another view of Thorndale, again axial. You'll notice that there's a focal point at the end, a little Palladian sort of temple that your eye lands upon. And the idea is that that focal point in the distance draws you down the LA, and when you get to that point, there'll be a view to the left and the right of different rooms within the garden. Again, potted plants right in the forefront. In this case, we're definitely sure that it's blue hydrangea. You notice too that the paving varies. The further you get away from a house in these sorts of schemes, the more informal the paving becomes. In this case, we see some simple stone pavers laid in turf, which is pretty on the edge of informal. Now, Coffin was not only known for her formal treatment of areas around the house proper, but as you get further away from the house to the perimeter parts of the property, she was very adept at woodland type plantings. In this case, we see the white birch is repeated, and we see a very large collection of bearded iris. It wasn't uncommon during the estate era to have gardens that were completely dedicated to one sort of plant material. After all, they had the space to do it. So it wouldn't be unusual to have a bearded iris border, a peony border, a rose garden, an aster border for the fall, you know, all in different segments of the master plan. So here we have our first picture of Gibraltar in Wilmington, Delaware. The client here was H. Rodney Sharp, and this commission was completed in 1919. I included this slide because I think it's a very clever way of developing an LA in the European tradition, but putting an American spin on it. To the back, on either side, those evergreen trees behind the borders, you'd expect them to be arborvitae or something of that sort, or cedar. They're actually bald cypress, which is very unusual to use as an LA. And then the edging of these beds on either side, edging the lawn, it looks as if it's boxwood, but it is not. They're actually low stone walls covered in ivy. And that really reduces the maintenance required because the ivy probably needs trimming once or twice a year, whereas boxwood would need constant maintenance. So there are things to be gained from looking at these slides if you sit down and study them even 100 years later. Of course, being landscape architecture, part of it is designing outbuildings and focal points. At Niederhurst Estate, which was built for Robert C. Hill, and the gardens built in 1922 and 23, Coffin designed this pigeonnier, otherwise known as a dovecote. And that lower room is actually a tool shed, but it's a good way of putting a utilitarian space in a garden scheme, but keeping it ornamental at the same time. You'll see that this is probably in a perimeter area of this estate. There are mature trees, and she's sort of sneaking the garden in underneath those mature trees. Again, another picture of Niederhurst in Palisades, New York. And she worked within many different styles. And she didn't only do the Italian European style. I would call this a much more vernacular American style. It's very sort of farmhousey. No matter the style she worked in, she had a very good grasp of plant material. She studied not only at MIT, but at the Arnold Arboretum. And she kept extensive notes of planting combinations over the course of her career. Again, I'm not so sure the coloration on this slide is correct. It seems a little bit muddy to me. But. Now, lastly, I included pictures of the Oaks in estate in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which was built for Edgar W. Bassick in 1927. But she worked on this estate between 1927 and 1945, developing it and redeveloping it. The only two photos I could find that really weren't the best, I think, representation of probably what was found on that estate. But in the end, after 20 years of work, she was awarded the Gold Medal of Honor from the Architectural League of New York for her master plan of the Oaks at Bridgeport, Connecticut. As with many of her gardens, and pretty much many of the gardens of everyone who's speaking about tonight, little of that estate remains except the bare bones, sort of the hardscaping portions of it. Here's another picture of the Oaks in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This is the rose garden. Again, I doubt all the roses were pink, but that's really at the hand of the colorist making that decision. So overall, I think people these days, especially with the pandemic, are looking to visit gardens. And so here's a list of Marian Cruger Coffin gardens, which are open to the public. I've included the websites so that you can actually check to make sure they are open, given the situation. One I think you really should be aware of is, let me see at the bottom, Fort Ticonderoga. She was actually related to the King's, it's the King's Garden, and she redesigned the sort of neoclassical, well, actually it was colonial revival garden at Fort Ticonderoga. It is still extant, so if you're way up that way, you should take a look at it. And it's also very much worth visiting Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. It's a former DuPont estate. It is now a botanic garden. Mount Cuba Center really does a lot of great research into plant varieties for the homeowner. So if you are interested in herbaceous perennials, it's a great place to visit to learn about things like heuchera and everything else under the sun that homeowners like to plant in perennial borders. So I hate to give short shrift to each of these ladies. I could do a lecture on each one of them. So I'm going to give you references for additional reading if you want to learn more about Marian Cruger Coffin. The title of the book is Money, Manure, and Maintenance. Those are actually the three ingredients that Marian thought were essential to any successful garden. Notice how money is listed first. But this book is by Nancy Fleming. It is still in print, and it gives a very good overview of the scope of her career over 40 or 50 years with a lot of illustrations, and the footnotes are actually excellent as well. So next, we're going to talk about the grande dame of early landscape architecture for women, and that would be Beatrix Jones Farrand. Her quote, her voice from the garden is, "It is work, hard work, and at the same time, it is perpetual pleasure. With this grand art of mine, I do not envy the greatest painter or sculptor or poet that ever lived. It seems to me that all arts are combined in this." I would have to say of the four women I'm profiling tonight, Farrand would be considered probably the most prominent in terms of her depth and scope of her career. She was born in 1872, again to an established family in New York's Old World Society. After debuting in 1890, she rejected the prospect of life as a society wife and pursued a career in landscape gardening, driven by her love of plants and flair for design. At the time, this would have been 1890, there were no formal courses of study in landscape architecture. Instead, she studied botany and horticulture under Charles Sprague Sargent at the Onondaga Arboretum, followed by a months-long tour of more than 150 European gardens, which she executed with her mother and her aunt, in part Edith Wharton. Private tutors from Columbia University provided instruction in civil engineering, and Beatrix Jones launched her career in 1895, and thanks to family connections, many commissions soon followed. Early projects in Newport came via Beatrix's aunt, as I mentioned, Edith Wharton, who summered at Land's End, which is still extant. But the bulk of Beatrix Jones' early work came from her social circle in Bar Harbor, Maine, where her family summered at Reef Point. By 1900, she was working on projects in Tuxedo Park, New York, as well as several on Long Island's Gold Coast. Her signature style combined a picturesque setting with formal gardens in the European tradition, complete with statues, fountains, and ornamental benches, all in very grand style. Plantings were generally en masse and carefully coordinated seasonal schemes to provide broad sweeps of texture and color. It was assumed that the design and installation of such estates required extensive, and I do mean extensive, maintenance and full-time staffing, requirements which spelled the demise of many such estates by the mid-20th century. At the end of this, I'll tell you which estates you can still visit, which Farrand designed. In 1913, Jones married Max Farrand, a distinguished Yale historian, and her career now as Beatrix Farrand continued to soar. Commissions followed from Yale and Princeton universities, the New York Botanical Garden, and even the White House. Beatrix Farrand became the grande dame of American landscape architecture Over the course of her career, she completed over 200 commissions and was a founding fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. So I'm going to walk you through some of Farrand's gardens, both in Bar Harbor and elsewhere in the United States. I chose this one as an opening slide because she started her career in Bar Harbor, and I think this is a really charming photo in which I actually think they got the coloration correct. This is the farmhouse in Bar Harbor, Maine. The client here was Miss Mildred McCormick. It was a family estate that had several residences on it, and Farrand worked on this between 1923 and 1928. She had a very good eye for detail. So where you see the gate with the roof matching the roof of the house, the gate having a little, although you probably can't see, a little carved squirrel on the top of it. Every little detail was figured out and was very tastefully done. The garden itself is a very sort of Gertrude Jekyll, English style cottage garden. In this case, it's a cool color scheme with gray foliage, lots of gypsophilia and pastel flowers to complement that. So this would be a very sort of farmhousey, simple scheme, sort of colonial revival, but she was also capable of extremely elegant and more opulent schemes. This is Carnarvon Lodge. It was built for John Stuart Kennedy in 1900. The Garden Commission followed soon after. This was considered the grandest estate on Mount Desert Island, but was demolished in 1960. The garden in question here, the one we're seeing, was actually the sunken Italianate garden. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a little bit heavy-handed for Farrand. It didn't have the sort of elegance of her other things did, and I thought maybe it was an early work. But it turns out that the garden itself was the footprint of it, and its elements, the architectural elements, were designed by the architect, Rowe and Baker of New York City. So she was only responsible for the planting and not the fountain and the coping and such. More typical of Farrand's work would be this flower border down on the coast in the same estate, Carnarvon, in Bar Harbor. And a picture like this, first of all, the view might be enough, but improving upon this view is even more difficult. Having been an estate gardener, I can tell you that keeping a flower border in pristine condition and actually alive in the midst of wind and salt spray is an accomplishment. So these Bar Harbor gardeners really knew what they were doing. Now on to one of Farrand's masterpieces, the Eyrie. This was built for John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. Farrand spent 10 years on this project starting in 1926. John D. Rockefeller was so impressed with Farrand's work at the Eyrie that he hired her to consult on the native roadside plantings of the carriage roads in Acadia National Park, much of which still exists. So as you drive through the carriage roads in Acadia, you think it's natural, but in fact, much of it is planted and was designed. By the way, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's father was a Rhode Island senator, so there is a Rhode Island connection here. Now, in the case of this garden, the Rockefellers enjoyed an Asian tour in 1921, and over the course of that tour, they collected many Asian antiquities. In this picture, you see a temple gate, which is actually capped with authentic tiles from a Peking garden wall. And beyond, you can see some sculpture forming in L.A. Those sculptures are 15th century tomb sculptures from China. I think it was the Yi dynasty, if I remember correctly. And they form in L.A. to a focal point at the end of the garden. I think this is very masterful in terms of design, because if you were presented by a client with an outstanding collection like this, you might be tempted to try and put it in an Asian setting. She did exactly the opposite. She has like a clamshell walkway surrounded on either side by native ground covers. There's kinnikinnick and lowbush blueberry and bunchberry dogberry, I should say, and native spruces and pines. So she took the native flora and by contrasting them with these white sculpture, really made a very striking composition. She also knew, however, being a student of landscape history, that Asian gardens do not have flower gardens. And this garden is, in fact, mostly a flower garden, which is viewed from the outside through many Asian-style gates. This is a bottle gate, which is a traditional Chinese form. And this is what the center of the garden actually looked like in its heyday. It's largely a cutting garden and a perennial border garden. To the left and right of your screen, there are perennial borders, and that center panel that's so colorful in the center of the picture is actually all annuals. So you can only imagine how much maintenance this entailed. Every year, those annuals would be repatterned, usually by Mrs. Rockefeller, but Farrand did come back every year to consult on this garden. If you were to visit today, which you can, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of this section, you would see that the central panel was in fact too much maintenance and it is now lawn, but the garden is still very much intact and very much worth the trip. Another Bar Harbor garden, this one built for Dr. Edward C. Dunham in Seal Harbor, is Keewaydin. And this was sort of a Tudor style house that had a garden that led you down to the sea and the view of Mount Desert beyond. The reason I chose this slide is that this estate was completely destroyed by fire in 1947, as were many estates in Acadia National Park and on Mount Desert Island. There was a huge wildfire, and many estates and gardens were lost, and really most were never recovered or rebuilt. Here we are at Elm Court in Lenox, Mass. We've left Maine and gone to the Berkshires and the estates of the Berkshires. This is Elm Court, which was built for William Douglas Sloan and his wife, Emily Thorne Vanderbilt. So Emily Thorne Vanderbilt was the sister of Cornelius and William Kay. Elm Court was considered the most opulent and was the largest estate in Lenox, and Farrand did the master plan for it. I believe she started in 1908 and continued to work on it for about 12 years. This estate is no longer extant and the gardens have been lost. There are a few more photos like this in the archive of the Garden Club of America. You can see Farrand's command here of garden elements though. She designed everything using beautiful construction drawings, and she also did wonderful, beautifully rendered and watercolored vignettes for her plans. She had a great sense of style and proportion, and it's evident, I think, in this photograph. Now, if you recognize this building, you move in pretty good circles, because today, this is the Canyon Ranch in Lenox. It's still extant, but originally it was built for Gerard Foster, and the architects were Cruger and Hastings. It was built in 1905. Farrand consulted on the plantings. She was not responsible for this long pool and the fountain, which was designed by Cruger and Hastings. Unfortunately, again, Farrand's work at this site is really no longer in existence. She did a large parterre garden out back with boxwood scrolls and all sorts of floral planting, but it did not survive. This property fell into huge disrepair and was renovated and opened as a spa, I think in the early 1990s. Now, Farrand was one of the first, if not the first, American landscape architect woman to receive larger commissions. In this case, Princeton University. Came through a residential client of Farrand, Mrs. Moses Taylor Pine. She was the wife of the chairman of the grounds committee at Princeton. So that's how things work. And in 1912, she introduced Farrand to the grounds committee. They hired her, and Farrand continued to work at Princeton almost to the end of her career. This residence, Prospect House, was the president's residence, and at the time, it was inhabited by Woodrow Wilson and his wife, and they're going to pop up in a few minutes at another important estate. Now I'm going to close out Farrand with some words about Reef Point. Reef Point was her family's summer residence, built in the 1880s, I believe. They were among the first people to decamp to Mount Desert Island. And they built a very humble house there. It was always Farrand's intention to retire there. And as she reached retirement, she became very concerned about her legacy, how she would be viewed. She knew that she had an important career. So she decided to develop Reef Point into a library and a resource center for landscape architects and visitors to appreciate the flora of Maine, especially. So she took her life's collection of plant material and had it all organized and cataloged as a botanic garden at Reef Point. She also established her archives there, which were extensive. She also purchased Gertrude Jekyll's archives to include at Reef Point. And so it became really a major sort of resource and something that was becoming a major enterprise. It started in 1941 or so, had very difficult years through World War II. Sometime briefly right after World War II, her husband Max Farrand died, and Reef Point became funded through the Max Farrand Fund, which was a memorial fund. However, she found it increasingly difficult to run her nonprofit because she could not afford the taxes in town, which went way up after the 1947 fire. And she couldn't find the appropriate staff to maintain the gardens to the standard that she wanted. She had her personal staff, which had done an excellent job, but what she was creating needed above and beyond what her personal staff could accomplish. So she made sort of the radical decision in 1956 to disband the entire operation after about 14, 15 years of putting it together. She not only disbanded it, she actually disassembled the entire garden and donated plants to other botanic gardens. She had the house dismantled piece by piece and gave away parts of the house. She sent her library and her archives, including Jekyll's, to Berkeley University in California. She left absolutely no trace of Reef Point, and today it's a subdivision. And that's pretty much, you know, the sad story of some of these estates. She went on to live at Garland Farm with her household staff, and Garland Farm up in Acadia is still there and is now operated as a learning center about Beatrix Farrand. I had to include this picture, even though it's not a glass lantern slide, with the recent kerfuffle about the Trump treeless rose garden. I wanted to call attention to the fact the rose garden is the west garden, and here we have the east garden at the White House, designed by Beatrix Farrand for the Wilson administration, who she had met back at Princeton when they were living in the president's residence. This is still in place. However, during the Kennedy administration, it was modified, and today it is known as the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden. So there are some great Beatrix Farrand gardens to visit. First and foremost, top of the list, Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. It is operated as the Dumbarton Museum by Harvard University. It is very much intact. It is sort of an in-town estate with a series of garden rooms, all different, surrounded by a number of naturalistic gardens. It's really one of her masterworks. I'd also heavily encourage you to get to the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Garden. I showed that to you. It was the Erie in Seal Harbor, Maine. It is open late summers and early fall. I've been probably too many times to count, and each time I'm more impressed with it. She also did parts of college campuses, and I think it's really hard to discern who designed one part of a college campus as opposed to another. She did parts of the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, parts of Vassar College, Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. But really, if I were to recommend any two places to go, it would be Dumbarton Oaks and the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Garden. While you're at the Abbey Rockefeller Garden, you could also visit Thuya Gardens in Astaku Terraces in Northeast Harbor, because many of Farrand's plant collection ended up in those two gardens, and she had a large hand in improving those two sites. For reading, you cannot beat a Judith Tankard book for research. So Beatrix Farrand, Private Gardens, Public Landscapes by the Monticelli Press is excellent. It really is a comprehensive overview of her entire career. It is full of footnotes, which I have found very helpful. And I actually think it's a very sort of entertaining read. It's a great coffee table book. It's beautifully illustrated. Now, for a change of pace, I'm going to talk about someone you probably have not heard of. And that is Martha Brooks Brown Hutchison. Her quote is, "I was fired with a desire, in spite of all the fact that it was considered almost social suicide and distinctly matrimonial suicide for a woman to enter any profession." As you can tell from her quote, she was a real character. She studied as well at MIT after studying at the New York School of Applied Design for Women. She also studied at the University of Maine. She studied botany of New England there. After 2 years of study at MIT, she opened her own practice in Boston and quickly enjoyed success with the New England country estate set. By 1906, Brown moved her firm to New York City due to popular demand and expanded her clientele to include the New York suburbs and Long Island, New Jersey, and its environs. In the first decade of her practice, she completed over 70 commissions, almost exclusively country estates. Her estate designs were very much like Coffin's in that they combined traditional European acts of symmetry. After all, they both studied under Guy Lowell at MIT with exuberant plantings. She was very much in favor, though, of using American native plant material. In 1910, she married William Hutchison and moved to Murchison Farm in Gladstone, New Jersey, which became the center of her interest. She stopped working for clients at that point and really began focusing on lecturing and writing. And she put all of her design expertise into her own estate, Murchison's Farm. She was also a founding member of the Garden Club of Somerset Hills, New Jersey, and very heavily involved with the Garden Club of America. And she wanted the Garden Club of America to become really a force within the progressive era. It didn't work out that way, but that's the direction she wanted to take it. She believed that the dissemination of landscape architecture and garden knowledge from woman to woman could ultimately improve the quality of life for all Americans, sort of a trickle-down theory, not just the elite class to which she belonged and who enjoyed these great gardens. During World War I, Hutchison was active in the Women's Land Army, and that was a training corps of WLA farmerettes who she trained at her Murchison Farm. That was really an interesting prospect in that during World War I, men went off to war. Estates and farms did not have adequate labor. So she worked with the GCA and the Women's Farming Association to create this Women's Land Army. They placed about 15,000 women on estates and farms across the US to keep them going during the World War I years. Her most important accomplishment and what she's most remembered for is her 1923 publication, The Spirit of the Garden, which was the first American book by a woman landscape architect. She became a member of the Society of Landscape Architects in 1920 and was honored as a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects in 1935. Now again, her design, having been trained at MIT in the Beaux-Arts tradition, really focuses on having formal spaces by the house with axial views from living spaces, leading to areas out in the garden that become increasingly informal as you get out into the landscape. This is Old Acres in Old Westbury, Connecticut. It was designed for Mrs. Robert Bacon. And you can see that her house is right there. The sunroom is there. There's a fountain right outside the sunroom. And that garden rose arch frames a view, I'm sure, in the opposite direction. That's very striking. The transition between the formal parts of the garden and the more naturalistic parts of the garden at Old Acre was this lily pond with its brick coping and its colonnade surrounding. On the opposite side of that pond, you entered into the more wild and naturalistic landscape. And this is what Hutchison was known for. She was a proponent of Native American planting, and she believed in taking a landscape and inserting a garden sort of underneath the existing woodland, which she did in this case. Again, I sort of dealt the coloration of this slide. It's a little bit exotic, but this is one woodland view and here's another with all of its spring bulbs in their glory. This was really her specialty, was to create a sense of place that was uniquely American. Here's another picture from Old Acres of a meadow pond. She would oftentimes research native combinations of plant material at real sites, real ponds and real meadows and real woodlands, and then use the native plants in those same combinations in her landscape designs. Another estate in Glen Cove, New York, Welwyn, was built for Mrs. Harold I. Pratt. And again, near the house, very European formal gardens, boxwood edges, formality and symmetry. And as you get further out into the landscape, a very naturalistic picture. Here's a pond at Welwyn in Glen Cove, New York. And I included this slide of Maudsley in Newburyport, Mass, because Maudsley State Park is now a Massachusetts state park. The original master plan was done for Mr. Frederick S. Mosley. And again, the highlights of this estate master plan were its woodland plantings and its native plantings underneath the existing tree canopy. That is really a great state park. All the bones of the original state are still in existence. So it's worth the trip if you're on Boston's North Shore. There aren't as many gardens to visit under Martha Hutchison. As I said, she only practiced with clients for about 10 years and then focused on writing. So if you really want to get to know her work, read her book, The Spirit of the Garden. It was republished by the American Society of Landscape Architects about 10 years ago, I believe. But if you want to visit some of her gardens, you go to Bamboo Brook Outdoor Education Center, which is her farm, Murchison Farm, in Gladstone, New Jersey. All of the hardscape and the bones of the garden are still there. Some of the plantings, the ephemeral plantings, have been lost. She also worked on the Longfellow National Historic Site in Cambridge, Mass. And she also the Marsh Billings Rockefeller Historic Site in Woodstock, Vermont, which I visited, which is also a great place to go. And again, if you can get to Maudsley and Newburyport, by all means do it. For more reading, I would recommend Unbounded Practice, not only for this landscape architect, but for dozens of other women who practiced in the early days of landscape architecture. The author's name is Thaisa Way. She's a professor at the University of Washington, I believe, in Seattle. And it's an excellent, excellent book, which covers literally dozens of women landscape architects from this era. Maybe someday we'll talk about more of them. Our last landscape architect for this evening is Ellen Biddle Shipman. She was someone I was almost wholly unfamiliar with before getting into this research. And she was a character. Her quote is, "Before women took hold of the profession, landscape architects were doing what I called cemetery work. Until women took up landscaping, gardening in this country was at its lowest ebb." That was actually a not unveiled slam of the Olmsted brothers, who she thought were doing too much green and not enough color. And a lot of their work, she felt their public garden work or park work was too reserved, which her work was not. You'll see that from her slides. She was born in 1869 into the Biddle family, yes, that same Philadelphia dynasty. But she wasn't on the wealthy side, she was on the military side, and she ended up growing up with her military father in the southwest of the US and was sent back to the east for her education and for summers. She went to Radcliffe College when it was known as the Harvard Annex, and while there she met and married Louis Shipman, a fellow Harvard student and aspiring playwright. That couple befriended a progressive intellectual community of creative artists and ended up moving to the artist colony of Cornish, New Hampshire, a village renowned for its American cottage gardens. Here the Shipmans became an integral part of a close-knit group, including Augusta St. Gaudens, Maxfield Parrish, and most importantly, her mentor, Charles Platt, who was an architect during the state era. So in Cornish, Shipman thrived in the creative atmosphere, taking part in literary and artistic endeavors of every kind, but she was known for her skill in gardening and horticulture, and she was asked by other residents of Cornish to lend a hand in the design of their gardens. When the Shipmans, as a couple, separated in 1910, Ellen was the sole provider for her 3 children and needed to come up with some means of income. She was 41 years old. She knew that she knew her horticulture, and so she appealed to Charles Platt to help her train in landscape architecture. So she apprenticed under Charles Platt, and it's sort of a case where the student outstrips the teacher. She very quickly became successful and renowned for designing country landscapes. By the 1920s, Shipman's clients list included names like Astor, Ford, Edison, and Goodyear, among many others. And as her practice grew out of necessity, she needed to move from Cornish, New Hampshire to Manhattan because she wanted to be by the trains, because she traveled all over the country. She ended up purchasing Beekman Place. She actually owned one Beekman Place, which today is a very Tony address. So that was both her home and her studio. Her studio housed dozens of young women landscape architects, not only from MIT, but from the Lothrop School of Landscape Architecture, which was for women only in Groton, Mass. So Ellen Biddle Shipman's design aesthetic combines strong axial geometry and the colonial revival manner. So think of very simple garden layouts, 4 squares, straight axial plans with crossing paths, maybe they'd be in a scribed circle at the intersection, that sort of thing. Her designs were extremely maintenance intensive. She was a plants woman, and comparatively few of her gardens have survived intact. Between 1911, when she started her firm, and 1948, when she retired, Shipman completed over 600 commissions, more than any of her contemporaries. And she did that by taking almost any job that came to her. She would do anything from a perennial border to a complete master plan, and she traveled all over the United States. So here are her facts. I should have switched the screen, sorry about that. But one thing I did not mention is that Ellen Shipman's archives are held at Cornell University, and many of them are online and are searchable. So that's really helpful if you think you may have a Shipman garden. I'm going to recommend another Judith Tankard book for Ellen Shipman, but here's a quote that I think sums it up perfectly in terms of Ellen Shipman's work. "Domesticity, intimacy, and sensual seclusion characterize the best of Ellen Shipman's landscape design, distinguish them from the grander, self-consciously European schemes many of her colleagues created." We are not talking Beaux-Arts Italianate gardens here. We're talking colonial revival, American gardens. In fact, I don't think Shipman ever traveled Europe. She went from being married to working for the rest of her life. Here we have Chatham Manor in Fredericksburg, Virginia. This is an historic home. George Washington spent much of his youth in this house, and so it was an important commission for Shipman to have been asked to do. She worked there for Colonel and Mrs. Daniel B. DeFore in 1921 for about 2 or 3 years after that. The 1721 house is being renovated by Oliver H. Clark, the architect. So Shipman was hired at Fredericksburg to create a period garden that would evoke the times of George Washington, and that sort of colonial revival garden was right up her alley. Here we see the garden that she inserted to the side of the house. It is colonial revival to the hilt, boxwood edging, little English boxwood, lots of patterning, flowering plant material, topiary at the corners of the beds, the whole mile in terms of colonial revival. Here's another view at Chatham. The pergola is new, as are all the plantings here. It's hard to believe this looks like an old established estate garden, but in fact, when Shipman started work here, it was a farm field surrounding the house. So quite a transformation took place under her direction. Shipman was a great collaborator, and in this case, Fort Hill House, designed for Mrs. Willis Delano Wood, was a collaboration between the Olmsted brothers and Shipman. The Olmsted brothers did the master plan, and Shipman inserted her own gardens. I chose this slide because she often included handicrafts, like the jardinières on either side of this wall opening, and the sculpture in the distance. Her art was usually done by contemporaries or people she knew from Cornish, so she was always looking to include their work in her work. Now, Coffin did not have a secure hold in every DuPont. Owl's Nest in Greenville, Delaware was actually owned by Eugene DuPont, and this was his summer estate. And here we have a picture in the very distance there, covered by all that green, is the DuPont's sunroom. And here's a very typical colonial revival sort of setup. We have a straight path edged in boxwood leading to a focal point. This garden is still extant, however, you cannot visit it. It is the Greenville Country Club, but it has been completely restored. Much of it was still extant. I only included this picture because, frankly, I don't really like it. It looks like the Alamo to me. But anyway, I think the point is that Shipman most often walled off her gardens and made outdoor rooms that were completely enclosed either by greenery or by actual walls. And in this case, the Fitzsimons Garden in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, where she did many, many commissions, Grosse Pointe, is definitely an outdoor room with walls that is very secluded. But more typical of Shipman's work would be this. This is Bon Air. This is the garden of Mrs. Robert A. Franks. And what's interesting about Shipman is that whenever you look up her gardens, her client was always Mrs. somebody. She worked for women almost exclusively. She wasn't so much women that she would have met having given her talk at the garden club meeting. So she worked through a network of women. In this case, Bon Air, Mrs. Frank's estate is very typical for her. Turf paths, boxwood edging, very extensive, very complicated perennial planting. Here's another picture from that estate. One thing about her borders is that they're very heavily punctuated with uprights, things like garden ornaments or upright boxwood or topiary. So there was a lot of sort of regular punctuation. They just weren't flat plains. At the Ferry Garden in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, again, here's the problem with Shipman's gardens. The reason they aren't extant is that if these roses didn't survive, then the garden design simply didn't survive. They were completely and wholly dependent on horticulture. So all you'd be left with would be a brick path, and a brick path doesn't really amount to an estate worth visiting. But I can attest to the fact that those rose arbors took a lot of estate gardeners to keep maintained in such neat form. And lastly, this is the Shumway Garden in Lake Forest, Illinois. And again, a walled garden, again, colonial revival. I would have to say her strength was not necessarily in her garden accessories. You could see these little statues on the corners of the pool look a little bit out of scope, you know, they're not in proportion to the rest of the garden. So I'm sort of hoping the client put them there, but This is really what she was known for. This is the other side, the right-hand side of that same garden. She was known for her successive planting schemes. Here's the spring garden. And she knew so much about annuals, perennials, biennials, flowering shrubs, flowering trees, that she could keep a garden going from the last snow to the first frost. And that's why people hired her. So here are some Ellen Shipman gardens to visit. Chatham Manor, I have not been there. That is the childhood home of George Washington. One that is really great is the Cummer Museum in Jacksonville, Florida. Very much still, the Cummer Museum didn't know it was a Shipman estate until Judith Tankard researched her book, but it's still largely intact. If you visit Duke University, the terrace gardens there, the Sarah Caduke Garden are by Shipman. So she has a lot of things you can visit. Perhaps the most comprehensive would be Longview House and Gardens in New Orleans, where she not only designed the gardens, but did the entire interior design for the house, choosing all the interiors, carpets, everything. So, never having done this talk before, it is now 6:29, so I did pretty well. That is our last profile for the evening. I think we should move right over to questions. But lastly, let me just recommend a book for Ellen Shipman, which is Ellen Shipman in the American Garden, again by Judith B. Tankard. I think this is the University of Georgia Press, if I remember correctly. And that on the cover is actually the Cummer Garden in Jacksonville, Florida. So thank you very much. Let's move right on to questions so everyone can get to their dinner and their nightly news.
Thank you, Jim, for that. That was really interesting. And I really like the pictures. So we do have a couple of questions coming in, but I'm going to insert one of my own first. What do these 4 women landscape architects have in common other than just their career aspirations?
Well, in the case of Coffin and HUTCHESON, they both attended MIT. And I failed to mention that MIT was the only option for women starting in 1900. They had a program which was open to women. Other than that, they all came from prominent families, and they all were able to launch careers in firms because they had social connections. But more than that, I don't mean to take away from their accomplishments, but more than that, they were driven to succeed because they had different reasons for needing to succeed. You know, Shipman had children, and HUTCHESON's family didn't have a lot of money. Beatrix Farrand, her parents' money was bound up in a legal battle. So they all needed to make a living. And not many professional career paths were open to women. Farrand being the first actually advised the other 3 at different points in their career to pursue landscape architecture.
No, thank you for that. Someone asked if any of the women sponsored garden preservation.
Yes, especially HUTCHESON, who is heavily involved with the Garden Club of America, and the Garden Club of America was in turn involved in garden preservation. Of course, Farrand tried very hard to preserve her own legacy at Reef Point and failed, but she was successful in preserving her legacy in terms of her archives and her very well-researched library that she left behind. HUTCHESON did put her property, Murchison Farm, into trust, and that's how it became a property of the state of New Jersey. So they all did contribute in some way.
Very good. Someone just put in here that they were wondering if they did smaller projects or was it always something grand?
Well, Shipman, Ellen, would have been the one who was doing even small perennial borders. She would take a commission for the double perennial border at Mrs. So-and-so's house. So she would do much smaller commissions. Farrand did not. She worked on large commissions. HUTCHESON only worked for about 10 years with clients, and all of her commissions were large. You know, these were estate scale landscapes they worked on. Coffin, I don't think did anything small. So I think your only option there would have been Shipman if you're looking to hire someone for a small job.
This one's very interesting. Someone was wondering if they found any scrutiny as working women at all.
They did. You'll notice they all started their own firms. And the reason they all started their own firms is that men would not hire them. So they had to produce their own work. And Farrand, especially early in her career, found that she had to put really her foot down with construction crews and with the men on site because they were so unused to having a woman supervising their work and instructing them that she really had to be a little bit hard and cold with them. I think it was probably the same for all of them. But estate work most often was done in collaboration with estate gardeners and with estate staff. And so over the many years that these women would collaborate with estate staff, they would get to know the estate gardener, and they wouldn't need to be out there with crews of men they had never met. And so it became sort of an insulated and comfortable situation.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been hard back then.
Yeah.
This one, this may be a good one to end on, because I was wondering it myself. Who would you pick as your favorite out of the women that you just presented on?
Well, I think it would depend on what I was hiring them for. Unfortunately, I don't have an estate. But I think if I wanted the most elaborately and probably most detailed design work, I would go to Farrand, and I think she probably had the most elegant sense of taste. If I wanted the most exuberant flower garden I could get, I would have gone to SHIPMAN. And I also think that Ellen Shipman was probably the friendliest and the most down-to-earth person. She grew her huge client base because she was very well liked. She had a good sense of humor. She was very warm. She was, I guess, sort of fun to work with. And so people liked to work with her. Coffin, I think, was very rarefied. And having worked for the DuPonts and stayed within a small coterie of clients, you know, that was a very rarefied world. Not that Farrand wasn't in that. And then I think Hutchison, I included her in tonight's talk because I admired her environmental emphasis and her emphasis on native plants and progressive causes, because she was really speaking out for landscape architecture as a progressive era career that could change the world through good landscape design and planning, improving urban lives, etc. So it really depends on what work you are looking to do. I would love to have dinner with any or all of them.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for this. I wish we could get to more questions, but luckily this will be up on our website and on Newport Mansion's YouTube channel as well. And I want to thank all the participants for coming in this evening virtually to take part of this lecture. And I hope to see all of you in a couple of weeks at Patty Miller's Breakers geothermal presentation. But until then, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And Jim, thank you again so much for this.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice night.